Cristiano, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. Folks, it's time for us to take back control of our government. Now, before this bureaucratic, oversized, and self-serving federal government starves us of our property, our freedom, our rights, and our liberty. But to do this, we must shed conventional thinking regarding our political structure. We need to be revolutionaries in thought, dissidents in action. Only after we recognize what our government is doing to our freedom and our Constitution will we start taking it back. And this program is just about that. Today, we're pleased and honored to have as our guest Mr. Adam Taggart. He's an experienced Silicon Valley Internet executive and Stanford MBA. And we are going to be able to communicate, believe it or not. Well, I hope so. Hopefully he understands me. Along with Chris Matenson, who was on our program, I guess, a couple of months ago, right, Sally? A couple of months ago. Right. He's a co-founder of website peakprosperity.com. And folks, you have to go there. It is power-packed. It is the most comprehensive website on the net. It focuses on the challenges presented by society's unsustainable economic and energy policies, as well as global resource depletion. And today, we will be discussing those challenges. Please feel free to call in with your questions or comments, 646-652-4620. That's 646-652-4620. Would you put the telephone number online, the banner up there, please? 646-652-4620. And if you can listen in, or you can want to become part of our conversation and break in, just press the one button. Adam, welcome to Liberty Talk Radio.
Welcome, Joe. Welcome, Sally. Thanks for having me here.
Right. And right now you're a blank. Very good. Very good. Okay, there you are. Don't worry. We torture people at the end of every broadcast if they make any mistakes, so it'll be fun. I enjoy this. Well, thank you so much for being on our program. Let me start by asking, when we say peak prosperity, we're not saying that everything's going to cease and desist, or we're going to run out tomorrow, but we've reached the maximum of our productivity or resource depletion or easy resources or whatever that are available, and it's downhill from here on in, or it's going to be more expensive and cost more and be more, I guess, create more pollution in doing so. Or where are you with that? I guess I'm trying to grasp what peak prosperity really means.
Well, great question and astutely put. So yes, it's sort of a double entendre. In fact, maybe even a sort of a triple entendre. You had Chris on, so you probably heard from him the importance of the exponential functions that are happening in all of the systems that sort of our modern way of life depends on, our economy, our energy systems, environmental systems. And peak oil is a great example of that. And it might be a concept some of your listeners are familiar with, which is as you're beginning to draw oil out of an oil field, it's very cheap and easy to do so as you ride up the top of the curve of supply. But once you hit the peak of that curve, which was termed Hubbard's peak by M. Keegan Hubbard, who came up with this, each incremental barrel that you take out of the earth begins to become harder to extract and more expensive to extract, right? And as you go down that right-hand side of the bell curve, and you're descending on an exponential curve, the costs and inefficiencies are increasing exponentially. So we see that in a whole host of systems that basically mean, hey, once we pass that midpoint of prosperity in any one of those individual systems, what's it going to be like going down that back end curve? Now, you could take a pessimistic view of that and say, hey, as a global society, we have hit peak prosperity, where we've been enjoying the benefits of cheap, plentiful oil and other resources, and it's now going to get harder. At the same time, we're actually quite optimistic about the future, but it depends on the actions we take today. So, kind of one of the double entendres in there is we think we can help people achieve their own personal peak prosperity by making smarter decisions today.
Right. So we're not talking about, because with the fracking process, of course, we're extracting more oil now than we have in past 20 years, but it's becoming more difficult and more expensive to extract. And so when we talk about peak prosperity, we're talking the monetary aspects of that, the monetary cost of doing so. So it's going to cost us more money for the same barrel of oil eventually.
That's exactly true. Although I would say also there are other dimensions that come into play as well. So it's not only monetarily more expensive to extract oil from, say, a fracking field than from the old, spindle top type wells we used to have in the old days, but it's more energetically expensive. So back 100 years ago, we would drop a shallow well, we'd get a gusher, we'd get about 100 barrels of oil for a barrel of oil's worth of effort.
Right.
Now we're getting about 3 to 1, 5 to 1 with fracking. So it's much more energetically expensive. And of course, you extrapolate that down to a point at some point in the future where it takes a barrel of energy's worth of energy to get a barrel of energy's worth of energy, and you just wouldn't do it anymore.
Right. Well, there are those hopefuls that say, well, we're going to have eventually technology will bring us to a point where alternative fuels will be available. But so far, those alternative fuels are quite expensive and not as user-friendly in certain weather conditions as a fossil fuel would be. So there's a cost to that, and it may be quite expensive down the road. Do you see that solar energy and wind energy replacing, gas and oil and coal at an economical level?
Sure. Let me say it this way. I certainly hope at some point in the future they or other types of alternative renewable energies do. The problem is to what you're saying is we're nowhere close to that right now. You add up all of those alternative renewable sources together, and they're providing, in many cases, less than 1% of the total BTUs that we need to run our current economy. And in many cases, to create those windmills and put in those solar fields, et cetera, you need to use fossil fuels to actually make that happen.
Right.
So people all the time say, hey, I think you're underestimating, human innovation and technology. And we have always, as a species, migrated from to a higher yielding energy source. What's interesting is while we like to be optimistic, right now we do not see another energy source, even in the lab, that is higher yielding than what we are getting right now from the current fossil fuels that we're building. And even if there was a breakthrough tomorrow, and we in many ways are hoping for one, it takes many, many decades for new technologies to get up to commercial scale and to be able to be deployed, and then they take a massive infrastructure build out. That takes, again, decades, maybe 40, 50 years. So what we're saying is, look, we're not saying technology is never going to come help us, but we are looking out and saying we're pretty confident there's going to be some gap where we're going to start seeing material depletion in the fossil fuels that we're dependent on before there's an at-scale new technology willing to replace it. And your question about the alternative energy sources like wind and solar, those are lower yielding, less energy dense sources than what we're currently burning right now. And so this would be the first time in human history, at least recorded human history, where we migrate to a lower yielding energy source. And of course we need to ask, okay, so what are the implications of that?
Yeah, well, if solar energy would do much better near the equator where it's light, at least
Sure.
12 or 14 hours during the daytime. But once you gravitate to the North or South Pole, you find out that during the winter time, like if you're in Alaska, or if you lived in Iceland, for example, a friend of mine is a bartender in Iceland. He said, you'd hate the place because, he says, a few months out of the year, we never see the sun at all. So obviously solar energy wouldn't work in Iceland, and they could surely use it there. But they can't use solar energy because certain times of the year, of course, it's light almost 20 hours during the day, but in the wintertime, it's dark 20 hours during the day, so solar energy wouldn't work. So there really are geographic considerations as to where some of these alternative energies can work or not work.
Oh, absolutely, for sure. Particularly with windmills, and what you begin to find too is if you want to replace a material percentage of, again, what we're burning, say, for with oil right now, with something like wind energy, you begin to enter really interesting constraints pretty quickly in terms of there's just not enough rare earths available to create the neodymium magnets that these big windmills need, or there's just not enough trained engineers to be able to build them out at the type of build out rate that we would need to be able to get anywhere close to some of these replacement yields. So, it's definitely it's a vexing problem. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, if wind works well in certain areas, solar works well in other areas, but then you have to transport that electrical current usually a long distance, and by the time it gets there, it loses a good portion of its value. And for every unit that you generate, by the time it gets to the end user, it may be only 1/3 of one unit. Am I correct in that assumption?
You are. And I would say if there's one thing we really need technologically from a breakthrough standpoint, it's how to store electricity better than we are right now. Our storage technologies are still relatively unevolved from the early days. And, if we're going to get to a point where we're going to be powering metropolitan areas with alternative energy generated electricity, we need to have some way to store it so that it's available at night when obviously the sun isn't out or the wind's not blowing, right?
Right. Yeah. Now, are we making much progress in that regard, or are we still relying on the traditional battery concept, of storage?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of people out there who understand the market potential for, coming up with something that's a real breakthrough here. That said, I do feel like, we should be creating some sort of like Ansari X Prize for this field. We really should be giving as large an incentive as possible to the entrepreneurs out there to be able to crack this mystery, because it really is, of the energy challenges we face, I would definitely put this one in the top 3, if not the top 1.
Right. Well, now, obviously, a good portion of our oil goes into automobiles. But before we go there, before we leave there, I watch Shark Tank on television. There's 3 programs I watch on television. The 2 of them. Shark Tank is one, and Street Outlaws is number 2. Because I used to drag race, street race, back in the old days. And my wife says, "How could you watch those guys race?" I said, "Because every time they get on the starting line, I feel it. I'm like there. I know exactly what they feel like, and I can watch it all day long. And I like watch television, but I can watch Street Outlaws and I can watch Shark Tank because I love the business aspect of it. But there was a fella came on, not a contestant, but someone who had an idea that they wanted to sell to the sharks, and what it was a pendulum type of object that would be placed in the sea near shore, and as the waves came in, it would push it forward, and as the wave came back, it would push it back. And this thing, by virtue of the fact, by the motion of the sea and the force of the sea, it would move this pendulum back and forth, creating electricity. And it said it will go forever, and it won't cost a dime. And of course, the guy wanted like $3 million for a prototype and all sorts of stuff. He didn't get the money, but I thought the concept was interesting. Are there any things like that in the pipeline?
Well, yes. So tidal action has been, an opportunity that folks have been looking at for decades. This fellow isn't the first one to think of it, just FYI. There have been solutions out there with buoys and sea fans and whatnot. But on a larger scale, people are, and it's good that we're doing this. There's an awful lot of people out there that are getting very creative about ways in which we can create electricity or energy renewably and sustainably. And what's great about ones like that too is, that there's not much pollution. You've got to make sure you've got screens and stuff so that you're not, killing up sea animals while you're doing it. But again, the challenge with those is they're just not high yielding, right? They just don't put out the types of BTUs that we get from unlocking the hydrocarbon, or certainly on the nuclear side of things. So, I'm not saying at all that there's not a place for that type of technology. But the challenge is we are burning a certain number of BTUs, which is a pretty tremendous amount these days. And it's, how do we match that through other sources and of course grow, because the global demand for energy continues to march up year after year. It's not declining by any stretch.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to the question, and the most obvious question, Well, the electric car is right around the corner. We're going to be seeing electric cars by several manufacturers in 2017. Our problem has been solved. We have no more energy crisis. Why are we even talking about this?
Yeah. So, look, I'm a big fan of electric cars. Actually, I drive an electric hybrid myself.
Yeah, my wife has a Prius, and she does very well with it. She gets like 44 miles to the gallon or something.
Yeah. Look, I mean, to me personally, I think the future is electrifying the grid. I think it makes sense for a whole ton of reasons. But we've got huge challenges ahead of us. So, first off, all electric cars that are being manufactured, at least in the U.S. right now, still represent way less than 1% of the fleet. And that's with companies like Tesla, basically making as many as they can at the moment, right? So we get back to the concept of scale and deployment timeframe. Secondly, to make this a national solution, we're going to need infrastructure built out, right? We're going to need charging stations built, all across the country, major highways and in metropolitan and town areas. So that all should happen. There's just not a plan for that right now. So what that just means is it means time, right? Time and cost. Secondly, there's economic value that is baked into the existing fleet. 99.9% of all cars out there still burn oil to get from point A to point B. And many of them have, decades of usefulness left. So it's not like we're just going to scrap those cars overnight. We're going to drive them and then eventually begin to replace them with electronic replacements or electric replacements. So again, we all get back to this point I was raising about the time that this migration is going to take. Like I said, there's very good economic reasons. There's good national security reasons. There's good energetic reasons for us to do this. I think this is where we are headed. I think in 50 plus years time, pretty much we're going to see a nation of electric cars. It is going to require additional innovation to go along with it, such as the battery storage and solutions and stuff like that. We are going to need that to be able to get to a national fleet. But there's one thing I want to raise that doesn't get a lot of discussion, which is there's something called technological displacement, which the economist Maynard Keynes used to warn about. And it's a very real phenomenon, but it's not something that people really think about very much. So curious, what do you think the number one, what do you think the number one job is in the most states across America?
The number one job. I never gave that any thought. Let me give it 2 seconds of thought, and my pea brain will start vibrating a little bit. The number one job. I'm going to help you out.
It has to do with roads and driving.
I'm at a loss. I don't know.
No worries. It's trucker.
Trucker. Okay. Oh, I should have thought of that. Yeah. Okay. Very good.
And that's actually where the focus is being placed most initially on electrifying our transportation. Is hey, let's electrify the trucking fleet, and let's have self-driving trucks. And actually, last month it got a lot of attention. I think Budweiser took delivery of the first shipment made by automatic self-driving electric truck, and it was a crate of beer. So we are not that far away from being able to replace probably the vast majority of human truck drivers in petroleum burning trucks with self-driving electric truck fleets. Yeah. And we could probably do that in the span of maybe say 5 years or so, or at least make pretty large inroads. The question is what are you going to do with all that displaced labor? Right, I just mentioned it's the number one job across the majority of states in America. That job is one of the last few tickets to the middle class for the blue collar worker. What's going to happen to those millions of truckers that get displaced that quickly? So we have this additional vector of, well, we may actually have the technology to do it, but is there a societal vector where we need to maybe say, well, let's do this at a pace where we can come up with a plan and divert that talent into something else that's going to give them as much of an opportunity.
Yeah. Now, Pete, when I was young, back in the 50s. Well, I'm still young. Sadly, I'm still young. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm going on 74, but I don't act it. So what the heck?
He's very immature. No.
People, I remember when I lived I'm an East Harlem boy. I'm from the streets of Harlem, so don't mess with me, okay? Anyway, but when we lived in New York, it seemed like everyone was moving out to Long Island. And they didn't mind moving all the way out to Suffolk County, which was the eastern end of Long Island, and it took them an hour and a half to drive into the city because oil was inexpensive. It was very cheap. Uh-oh, we lost him. Hello? All right. Okay, calling back, folks. Don't go away. Somehow there's a line glitch.
He did mention some monsoons. He did mention the monsoons.
Oh, that's right. There is a monsoon where he is.
Maybe.
I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Okay.
All right. Not sure what happened, but it must have been the monsoon.
Okay. So let's blame the monsoon on that one. Okay. Well, people did that because oil was very cheap. I remember buying gas for 19 cents a gallon. And
wow.
I remember went up to 23 cents a gallon. Panic broke out. And when I had my hot rod, I went into a service station once. I never forget this. It was late at night. The guy came out. I guess I woke him up or something. And I gave him a quarter for a gallon of gas. He wanted to strangle me. But my point being is that energy was cheap, so you were able to afford to drive in for an hour and burn all that gas.
Sure.
They can't do that today. Will not the same thing happen here? As fossil fuels become less available or more expensive to produce, the cost of gasoline will go up and people's lifestyles will change. They will move closer in, or they'll find jobs that are closer to their home, or they'll work out of their home. So aren't there existential type of situations which will sort of self-correct that are not actually in line with the energy policy, but something removed but affects the energy consumption?
Sure. Well, the systems will certainly self-correct, and that's just true of any biological system, right. Where in any economy, right? The large scale challenge here is this goes back to the earlier discussion about higher yielding energy sources, right? The economy runs on net energy. So remember when we talked about the amount of barrels of oil of energy you need to expend to get a barrel of oil out of the ground?
Right.
Right. What's left over is the net energy, and that's what you have available to you to do things, to send trucks off to places or make factories build things or things like that. So as the cost of energy rises, usually also the energetic cost is rising along with it. So the net energy you're getting is lower. And certainly even if just the economic cost itself is rising, people and companies can afford less. And so the general point I'm trying to make is you're able to do less when energy gets more expensive. So, one of the challenges is that there may not be as much available to employ as many people making the same salaries they will all make. Now, people will adjust, right? But we have a pretty massive problem in this country already in terms of finding gainful employment for the people that we have. So you're probably aware, we have this record low unemployment rate of somewhere like 4.7% or something like that. But what that doesn't take into consideration is the amount of people who are not considered in the workforce. Right. And that number is something like 97 or 98 million adults right now.
That's right.
So we have almost 1 in 3 people living in the country who is an adult that has been declared this person's a lost case. They're never going to find employment, right? So those are the people that are, basically, drawing a lot of entitlements off of the system. And I'm not criticizing them in any way, shape, or form. But we already have a system where we are expending an awful lot to support an awful lot of people in a huge percent of our population that is not involved in gainful employment. So as this net energy, if we enter a net energy crisis where energy continues to become more and more expensive, we've got to figure out not only how to put the people who are working today to better use if their jobs get displaced or whatnot, And then we also have to figure out how do we still can deliver as many of the entitlements to these other people who aren't working, because otherwise they're going to get, very cranky about, they're all of a sudden not going to be able to support themselves, and we're going to have another bigger societal impact on our hands.
Yeah. Well, what concerns me is that the American mentality today is very different than it was many years ago, decades ago. I don't recall, but I've read articles about the Great Depression, where people were, government made available economic incentives to people to, not incentives, but programs to keep people from rioting or starving or whatever. But most people didn't take advantage of them because they felt it was unfair. It wasn't right. You don't take money from other people, without working for it. Today we have an entitlement mentality where, you don't believe it, but you owe me type thing. And I guess I'm of the old school. When a company that I worked for closed down, and everyone was let go, and I had a very good job there, and I could have collected a handsome unemployment check, and I passed by the unemployment office and I looked at it and I said, I can't do that. I just didn't want to stand there. I didn't want to fill out any forms, and I said, I'll figure out what I'm going to do. I'll make it somehow. And I did, and I did very well. I suffered for about 20 years, but I did very well for myself. But I couldn't do that. And I'm not patting myself on the back. I'm just saying it's a mentality that's so different. And when we say, we have to do something to help others, whatever, I always think to myself, no, we don't have to do anything. They have to do something for themselves. They have to pass by the unemployment place and say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'll figure this out. I may starve doing it, but I'm going to give it the good old college try. And I think this mentality is gone from our culture altogether, which really bothers me. Anyway, I think I went on a tangent, but I didn't mean to.
Well, no, but it is relevant to what we're talking about, and sadly, I can't disagree with you. It's really interesting. 100 years ago, something like 30% of the population was involved in farming and food production, meaning knew how to get out there and do manual labor, hard days work. Right now, that's less than 1%, and there's all sorts of tangents we can go on in terms of sort of the fragility of our food system and whatnot. Right. But I think that reflects a bit of the cultural shift that you're talking about, where we've really moved away from doing things for ourselves and really have this expectation that others are either going to do it for us or should do it for us. When you provide for people, you essentially enable. And when you do that, there's a huge chunk of people you've removed the incentive for them to have to work. And to be honest, I get it. I get it economically for households that are dependent upon government subsidization. A lot of the programs, if you add them up right now, if they went and got a job, to be able to enjoy the same amount of benefits, but self-funded versus government provided, they need to be making somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000, which for a lot of these people may not even be very realistic. And so they just feel, well, why try? Because I'm already getting more value than I'm going to have to go out and work for. So we really provide a disincentive. And I want to give one example. This is something that Chris and I surfaced at our seminars to help people kind of understand the importance of culture. I'm going to contrast two different cultures with the same different incident. So Katrina, right? We had a hurricane that created a massive storm surge, so there was tons of flooding of New Orleans. And within 24 hours, it became Lord of the Flies there, right? We had looting, we had vigilantism, we had cops shooting on civilians, right? It really just deteriorated extremely quickly. Contrast that with the tsunami in Japan, right? Actually, much greater loss of life, much bigger and greater damage done across more of Japan. And there were virtually no instances of looting. It was communities pulling together. The army and the police force were seen as saviors. People went and helped the elderly first, and they all rebuilt together quite quickly. Exact same insult, but two different, very different responses, and it's just because of the culture and the way that it's used to dealing with adversity.
Well, does that tell us that the America as we perceive it, to being this free country? For example, the Cato Institute put out a Human Freedom Index for 2014. It takes them about 2 years to compile all the information and digest it. And we're now in the Human Freedom Index, that's 2014, down to number 24. We were number 1, but now we're number 24. And if I suspect if we took this, the 2016 numbers, we would probably be closer to 30, which bringing us down the scale to countries that we always thought were not very free. Do you see this as an end to America as we know it?
Boy, I probably don't look at it with that that degree of gloom, but I do feel like, kind of like an alcoholic, you have to admit that you've got a problem before you can actually start working on self-betterment, right? And I do think we are still in denial as a culture, and it's sad, given where we were and the force that we've been, the example that we've been for the world, and given our potential as well. I'm probably more concerned by a lot of the causes of that, and I'm sure on your show you've had guests where you've talked about the just encroachment on civil liberty and the loss of freedoms that have been going on here. And I personally feel like this is another one of those exponential curves where we've lost, I think, more freedom since 9/11 than we had in the century leading up to that, right? So this is something that's continuing to accelerate. And I do think that in many ways it does that because of agendas that special interests have, powerful special interests have. There's the whole neoconservative, neoliberal movements inside the government that, for whatever reasons, but variety of them, really, push an aggressive interventionist policy. And that needs a strong military to support that. And I think we're even seeing examples of that with what really is, to me, kind of a perplexing beating of the war drum with Russia right now. I do think a lot of this is sadly just the playing out after, however many decades after President Eisenhower's warning of the military-industrial complex in his farewell speech, right? These organizations get to the point where they become self-serving. They need more conflict. They need more customers to sell military to be able to grow, right? And so they go out there and they stir up reasons why that's needed. And we're seeing that across the company with the militarization of our own police forces. So getting back to the spirit of your question, do I think this has spelled the end of America as we know it? No, because I still do have faith that we have, might be deep down in there, but somewhere in our cultural consciousness, we have enough memory of who we have been in terms of where we draw the lines between right and wrong, and we will stand up against government forces that we don't feel are serving in our interests. And the thing that gives me hope about that is this most recent election. And I'm not making a pro-Trump comment, but if you look at this extreme popularity of Bernie Sanders on the left and Trump on the Republican side, I think both of those were less votes for the individual candidates and their policies, and they were more rejection of the establishment. Right. Yeah, and you need to get to that type of flashpoint to have civil progress. And so I think we are beginning to stand up as a populace and say, you know what, we're not going to take what we're just being told to do for much longer. And granted, I think we've got a long way to go before we begin reversing some of these concerning issues. But I do think we have that in us as a people. If we're pushed far enough, we will finally get up and push back.
Well, I hope you're right, because the alternative is very ugly. In fact, there is no alternative. I mean, we don't even want to think about the alternatives. All right, now we know where we are. What do we do in the future, and how do we turn this around? We're looking to you for all the answers to all our problems.
And you had Chris on, right? He answered all this, right? You and I could just talk about drag racing, right?
Oh, are you a drag racer? Do you drag race at all?
No, I don't. I'm not nearly that cool, but I do want to hang out with you more now that I know you are.
Well, at least there's one reason why people want to hang out with me.
So, a big question, certainly one I won't be able to answer for everybody in the time we have left. I will say, look, this is the number one question that my partner Chris Matenson and I get at peakprosperity.com. As we talk about a lot of the challenges that you and I have been talking about so far, Joe, for those for whom the information resonates, they say, okay, I got it. You've opened my eyes. I'm maybe a little bit nervous, but okay, what do I do? We have kind of the chase. We have a lot of material around this on peakprosperity.com. We actually put it all into book form in a book called Prosper, How to Prepare for the Future and Create a World Worth Inheriting, which is available if you go to the front page of peakprosperity.com. So that's my quick way of saying, read the book and you'll know what we're about on that type of information. But to the spirit of your question, really what it is, it's about developing resiliency. So this starts at the personal level. We definitely say, look, don't wait for somebody to fix all this for us. If you're waiting for the government or some magic entrepreneur in a lab to fix all this, you're probably going to be highly disappointed. So we recommend a put your own oxygen mask on first strategy. So when we talk about resilience, we talk about the ability to react to any kind of development with the least amount of personal danger, right? So there's a lot of steps that we recommend that will reduce your vulnerability to these trends that we've talked about, whether it's a moribund global economy that could definitely potentially result in another stock market crash like we saw in 2008, whether it's increasing energy costs that just make us available to do less, both as a society and personally, whether it's some of the social and cultural risks that we've tapped on here just a little bit. So we use a framework that we call the 8 forms of capital, where we say, first off, when people ask us, what should I do? Usually that question initially comes from hey, I've worked pretty hard to create some financial wealth for myself and my family, and I'm worried about that going away. What do I do with my money? Very important question, and that actually money is a form of capital. We call that financial capital. But our advice is don't put your wealth in just that one bucket. There's actually many different forms of wealth that it makes sense for you to invest in so that you can build overall resilience. So if you come up with a diversified portfolio, you're going to be more resilient against any one particular economic risk, right? Similarly, you want to invest in your living capital, which is your body, your health, as well as the living systems that you depend on for your food and whatnot, right? Your material capital, so this might be your house, your car, the tools that are in your garage. Like, what are the things that you have that enable you to actually do things in the world? Stay dry, keep a roof over your head, whatnot. So these might be investments in energy efficiency. These might be things like, getting a hybrid car or whatnot, so you can run on different types of fuel, given what might be happening with any one given fuel type. These are things like social capital, which is basically what's your value and your role in your community? How many people are out there that will actually come to your aid if you have some sort of crisis in your life, whether it's you lose a job, whether it's you get sick or whatnot? What are the things that your community could do for you when you might not be able to provide them for you yourself? There's knowledge capital, which is what are the skills in your head and what's the expertise that you have. If you end up losing everything tomorrow, you still have the value that's in your brain in terms of, how you can actually create value with that. There's time capital, there's cultural capital, and boy, there might be one more I'm forgetting. But again, it's all in the book and on the website. But it's really telling people, look, first off, invest in your future, but expand your definition of what an investment is beyond just money. It's these other forms of capital. And the key thing that we try to turn off in people's heads are, look, Even if we're totally wrong about the future and our timeline for it, even if the next 50 years look just like the past 50 years and there's no energy crisis and the economy continues to grow from here and everything goes great, you're not going to look back on these investments that we're recommending with regret. You're never going to say,
Right.
gosh, I'm really sorry that I got in better health and better shape.
Right.
I feel terrible that I became more valuable in the community.
Food. I have too much food in my house,
Yeah, I've got too much food in my house. Or, boy, I actually saved too much money, right? I mean, all of these things are life-enhancing investments that we recommend. And of course, if we are right, these are going to take on a much greater and more outsized benefit in your life because you had done that before the crisis hit, right? That the worst time to try to prepare for a crisis is as the crisis is hitting, right? It's before. So, and of course, we've been recommending and advocating these types of investments for many years through Peak Prosperity, and we have couple million people a year that come through the website. So we've got lots of examples of people who have deployed these solutions into their lifestyles now for 3, 5, 10 years. And we've got lots of testimonials from them, both on the book and on the website. But in most cases, these people are saying, my God, it kind of felt a little funny when I went out and bought my first ounce of gold, or when I actually, started growing, a little bit of food myself in my backyard. And now I've found that this is a lifestyle I crave. Like knowing the benefits of it now, I would have run towards this, right? Yeah. So we're all about, as we say in the book, working to create a future worth inheriting. And we start with that at the individual level because that's where we personally feel that we can make the most difference. But we do hope that by getting enough individuals beginning to learn and act and behave like this, that will begin to filter up into communities, and then we'll begin, valuing these types of benefits, and then we'll begin electing people who share those values, and then, hopefully it all begins to kind of percolate upwards.
I know.
So that's kind of what we're about.
Yeah, people are starting to recognize that, like when I lived in Harlem, everything was very concentrated. My mother went shopping downtown to Bloomingdale's twice a year. We took the train. And that was it. I'm not kidding you. We went out to eat about 2 to 3 times a year, and that's because my father celebrated 2 birthdays. He had 2 birthdays. I think one on his passport and his actual birthday, and we went out twice to eat. This is how rare it was that we went out and did it. Everything was self-contained. There was family all around us. My uncle was next door, and he was a butcher, and we're so bifurcated now. We're so diluted in our family relationships and our lines of communication that compared to what it was years ago, that there's no longer this cohesiveness. And added to that, what bothers me is the demographics. The demographics for the United States are not good. Do you take that? When I say not good, in that there are fewer people being born, people living longer, so you have this large group of people like me, who are taking out of the system that which they put in, which people don't like to hear about. And now there are young people who are taking out of the system because they cannot find a job or they're unemployed, who have put nothing in the system. Plus, the government has already squandered my Social Security on other programs and wars and whatever. So now he has to make up for that shortfall. Plus, he has to make up for his own, unemployment check or whatever the case may be. I see the demographics here as being very, very dark, very bleak for our future. Do you take that in consideration, or am I just a naysayer?
No, we absolutely do. And our core asset at peakprosperity.com is a video series called The Crash Course, which lays out everything that we're talking about in the sort of online curriculum. It's a series of about almost 30 videos that walk through each of these sort of challenges and whatnot. And we have a pretty lengthy chapter there on demographics, so on exactly what you're talking about. So no, it's very, very real, and it's exacerbated, by this much more fragmented and insular culture that we have now, right? So, Joe, my sense is you probably look back on your days living there in New York with your family in that tight-knit community with fondness, right?
Oh, absolutely. People ask me, well, how do you like Tulsa? And I go, well, Tulsa's like, a girl that you meet. They say, people ask you, how did you like the girl? she was nice, and Tulsa is nice, and there was, I can go on for hours about living in Harlem in a community like that, and my uncle belonged to this. He was an officer in this very large corporation. I don't remember the name. It started with an M, but it wasn't Monsanto. He had a job. He was in customer service. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Oh,
Sorry.
Mafia?
I can't say the word.
Mafia,
But
yeah.
but everyone knew where they were, knew their place, and everyone watched out for each other. Everyone. And here I was, a young kid, and I used to roam the streets of Harlem all over the place. My mother never worried.
Right. So it sounds like to you, the Harlem you grew up in was not the nice girl. It was the girl you marry, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, contrast it in today's society where, we don't have multi-generational households. Everybody lives separately. Everybody's consumed in their social media, right? So you don't have that cohesion, but also to your point, that support where everybody has each other's backs, right? So instead, we're much more pitted against each other. And, demographically, we have 10,000 people that hit retirement age every day, right? Because the baby boomers are now, as old as they are. Here's a frightening statistic for you. The median, not the mean, because the mean gets skewed by the rich people, but the median, median 64-year-olds, the person who is just about to retire, has $17,000 saved up for retirement.
Oh my God.
Right? So we have a cohort of retirees, most of whom are completely financially unprepared to be able to retire, right? So what's happening is they're not able to stop working, right? So in the old days, until relatively recently in society, you'd have these younger people, coming onto the scene as young adults, and they would be stepping into the jobs that were being vacated by the retirees. But now the retirees aren't leaving because they can't afford to, right? So you've got this competition, right? This intergenerational competition between the young and the old, right? Because the young, want jobs, but they can't find them. They can't find good paying jobs because they're not becoming available at the rate that they used to be. And then compounding that is because of, and this isn't just a demographic problem, but because the policies that our government is pursuing that are creating and supporting asset bubbles, and I'm talking about housing specifically in this case, where the average cost of a house is gotten extremely unaffordable, certainly for the average millennial, right? So the ability to form capital is very difficult for them because they can't get good jobs or jobs at all, and then they can't, with what they're making, they can't afford a house, right? So they're looking at the system and they're saying, you know what, like there's nothing in it for me if the system continues the way that it is, and that's flipped around with the boomer who says, I have everything to lose if the status quo gets changed on us. So we are really getting pitted generation against generation here, and our cultural isolation just basically adds kerosene to the fire.
Yeah. It's strange because here I am, I tell people I'm 73 and a half. When I was 5 years old, I'd say I'm 5 and a half.
Right,
so
that half matters.
Now that I'm at the other end, I say I'm 73 and a half, pushing 74. I still work. And in fact, I'm going to be expanding the studio, and I'm going to go into I'm starting another business. And I go, what am I doing this for? I get bored to death. But, I'm the anomaly. I mean, I cannot imagine retiring with $17,000 in the bank. I just.
Well, you couldn't do it.
I couldn't. I mean, but I couldn't sleep at night knowing that. And yet, although I can afford to retire and not work for even if I lived a long life, never work another day, 1 minute in my life again, I would be bored to death after 6 hours. So I guess I'll die working, or I'll die here on the studio. Who knows what I'll be doing? But I have a couple of businesses, and I do all the background work now. I don't work out in the field anymore, but I do all the book work for them. And make sure everything's working well and everything like that. And I'm a support person, basically. But you're right, the demographics are working against us. Well, Right now, the clock is working against us, and I think we've taken a lot more time, more of your time than we anticipated. But this has been a fascinating conversation. And Adam, I do hope that you will accept our invitation to return at a later date.
It would be a pleasure, Joe. It's been so much fun chatting with you.
Thank you so much, and I hope to speak to you again really soon, and good luck to you.
You too, and happy holidays.
Thank you. Same to you. Folks, this is the end of today's broadcast. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is liberty comments at libertytalkradio.com. Remember, as my wife would say, you are either allowing your liberties to be taken away, or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well, stay tuned.